The Good Morning America studio was already tense before the cameras turned on. Not chaotic, not loud, just tense in the way that happens when everyone in the room knows something might go wrong, and no one's sure who will pull the trigger. Samuel L. Jackson was scheduled to appear on the show to discuss his latest film project and his upcoming Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy. It had been pitched as a celebration of his legendary career, his impact on cinema, and his journey from struggling theater actor to one of Hollywood's highest-grossing stars. But that was just the version the public saw. Behind the scenes, there were emails, conditions, and warnings. Samuel's publicist had been very specific about keeping the conversation focused on his artistic achievements and avoiding controversial topics. Good Morning America's producers had agreed, or at least they said they had. But just minutes before they walked onto the set, one of the producers whispered something to George Stephanopoulos about pressing him on his past controversial statements and holding him accountable for his inflammatory rhetoric. And George's entire approach shifted. The atmosphere in the studio carried an undercurrent of expectation mixed with barely concealed apprehension. The familiar GMA set, usually warm and inviting for morning television, felt different today, more like a trap waiting to spring than a place for celebratory conversation. The lighting technicians had adjusted their equipment to capture every micro-expression, every moment of what could become either a triumphant interview or a complete disaster. When Samuel finally stepped onto the set, the applause from the studio audience was immediate and thunderous. They knew they were in the presence of a living legend. Over 150 films, iconic roles that had defined multiple generations of moviegoers, a voice that was instantly recognizable around the world. Samuel wore a perfectly tailored black suit with a burgundy shirt, his signature style projecting both elegance and an edge that hinted at the intensity that had made him famous. His trademark bald head gleamed under the studio lights, and his eyes carried that familiar combination of intelligence and barely contained intensity that had made him one of cinema's most compelling presences. Robin Roberts provided the warm introduction that GMA was known for. She said, "We're absolutely thrilled to have the legendary Samuel L. Jackson with us this morning. Samuel, congratulations on your Lifetime Achievement Award. It's so well-deserved." Samuel's smile was genuine, his voice carrying that distinctive rhythm and power that had captivated audiences for decades. He said, "Thank you, Robin. It's been quite a journey, and I'm grateful to still be here, still working, still learning from every role." George immediately inserted himself into the conversation, his tone already carrying an edge that hadn't been there during pre-interview discussions. He said, "Samuel, you've had an incredible career, but you've also been very outspoken on political issues. Some of your statements have been quite controversial. Looking back, do you have any regrets?" A subtle shift occurred in Samuel's posture. His media instincts, honed over decades of interviews, immediately recognized the pivot from celebration to confrontation. He said carefully, "George, I've always believed that artists have a responsibility to speak truth as they see it. I don't apologize for having opinions." George pressed forward, his voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that had served him during his political career. He said, "But some of those opinions have been quite inflammatory. You've made statements about political figures that many would consider crossing the line. Don't you think celebrities should be more careful with their words?" The temperature in the room began to shift. Robin Roberts looked uncomfortable, recognizing that this wasn't the direction the interview was supposed to take. Samuel's diplomatic smile became more strained, his eyes beginning to show the intensity that had made him legendary in both dramatic and action roles. He said, "Careful with my words? George, I'm an actor. I make a living with words. I choose them very deliberately." George leaned forward, sensing what he perceived as an opening. He said, "But when you use your platform to make divisive statements, when you attack people personally rather than focusing on policy disagreements, aren't you contributing to the toxic political climate in this country?" Samuel's jaw tightened, his famous intensity beginning to surface. The diplomatic facade that Hollywood had taught him to maintain was starting to crack under the pressure of what felt like a personal attack disguised as journalism. He said, Divisive statements? George, speaking truth to power isn't divisive. Calling out hypocrisy isn't toxic. What's toxic is pretending that everything is fine when it's not. George's voice took on a condescending tone that made everyone in the studio uncomfortable. He said, "But surely you can see the difference between legitimate criticism and personal attacks. When you resort to name-calling and inflammatory rhetoric, aren't you just contributing to the problem?" That's when something fundamental shifted in Samuel's demeanor. The years of dealing with Hollywood politics, industry racism, and media manipulation suddenly crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. He said slowly, each word carrying the weight of decades of accumulated experience. Name-calling? Inflammatory rhetoric? George, let me tell you something about rhetoric. His voice began to carry that distinctive edge that had made him unforgettable in films like Pulp Fiction and Snakes on a Plane. I grew up in the segregated South. I lived through the civil rights movement. I've seen real oppression, real injustice, real consequences for staying silent. George remained seated, but his confidence was clearly shaken by the directness and power of Samuel's response. He said, "That's a different era. Is it?" Samuel's voice cut through the response like a blade. "Is it really, George? Because from where I sit, I still see young black men being killed in the streets. I still see voting rights under attack. I still see people trying to whitewash history and pretend that racism is ancient history." He stood up slowly, his full 6 feet 2 inches frame suddenly dominating the small interview space. The movement was controlled, deliberate, but charged with an energy that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. "You want to talk about inflammatory rhetoric? Let's talk about the rhetoric that says I should shut up and entertain people. Let's talk about the rhetoric that says successful black men should be grateful and quiet." The studio was completely silent now. Even the crew members had stopped their usual movements, transfixed by the raw power of Samuel's response. Samuel continued, his voice building with the kind of intensity that had made him one of Hollywood's most compelling performers. "I've been in this business for over 30 years, George. I've watched talented black actors get passed over for roles. I've seen scripts where the only black characters were criminals or victims. I've fought for representation, for dignity, for the right to be fully human on screen." George tried to regain control of the interview, his political instincts telling him to redirect. He said, "But surely progress has been made." "Progress?" Samuel's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You want to talk about progress? George, I'm 65 years old, and I just got my first Academy Award recognition. You think that happened because Hollywood suddenly discovered I could act?" He walked around the interview area, his movement reminiscent of his most powerful screen performances, controlled, purposeful, but crackling with barely contained energy. "It happened because people like me refused to shut up and be grateful for scraps. It happened because we kept pushing, kept speaking out, kept refusing to accept that this is just how things are." The audience was riveted. Several people looked genuinely moved by the raw honesty of his words. George's face was flushing red, his usual composure completely shattered. He said, "I'm not saying you should be silent." "Yes, you are." Samuel's voice filled the studio with an intensity that made the cameras shake. "That's exactly what you're saying. You're saying that when I call out injustice, when I refuse to be polite about oppression, when I use my platform to speak for people who don't have one, that's somehow wrong." He faced George directly, the full force of his presence focused like a laser on the increasingly uncomfortable host. "You know what's really inflammatory, George? It's people like you who think that black anger about injustice is more dangerous than the injustice itself. You think that my words are more harmful than the systems that created the need for those words." The studio was electric with tension. Samuel's authenticity was overwhelming George's practiced television persona in a way that was almost painful to watch. Samuel continued, his voice carrying 40 years of experience dealing with people who wanted to control how he expressed himself. "I've played villains, heroes, and everything in between. But the role you want me to play is the grateful Negro who's thankful for his success and doesn't make waves. Well, I'm not playing that role." George made one desperate attempt to salvage his position. He said, "I never suggested." You suggested exactly that. Samuel's voice cracked like thunder. You suggested that my words are the problem. You suggested that I should be more careful about speaking truth. You suggested that calling out hypocrisy is somehow toxic. His voice built to a crescendo that filled every corner of the studio. Let me tell you what's toxic, George. What's toxic is a media that's more concerned with tone policing black voices than addressing the issues those voices are raising. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, his movements decisive and final. You know what? I'm done with this. I'm done with people who think they can lecture me about how to use my voice. As he put on his jacket with the dignity that had made him a legend, he delivered his most devastating blow. I came here to celebrate a lifetime of work, of breaking barriers, of representing my community with pride and dignity. Instead, I got lectured about being too loud, too angry, too unwilling to shut up and smile. George was visibly shaking now, his face red with embarrassment and anger. He said, "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant." Samuel's voice was deadly quiet now, which somehow made it even more powerful. "You meant that successful black men should know their place. You meant that we should be grateful for opportunities instead of demanding equality. You meant that we should whisper about injustice instead of shouting about it." He walked toward the exit, then turned back for his final statement that would be replayed millions of times. "Let me tell you something, George. I didn't claw my way out of segregated Tennessee, fight through decades of Hollywood racism, and build a career on my own terms just to have some former political hack tell me how to use my voice." His voice carried across the studio with the authority of someone who had never backed down from a fight. "I've been angry about injustice my entire life, and I'm not stopping now. If that makes you uncomfortable, if that seems too inflammatory for your morning show, then maybe you should examine why black anger bothers you more than the things we're angry about." He looked directly at George one final time. "And maybe you should remember that the reason you have a job asking these questions is because people like me refused to stay quiet when it was convenient." The studio erupted as Samuel walked out with perfect dignity, leaving George sitting alone at the desk, completely humiliated. Robin Roberts tried to salvage the segment, but the damage was irreversible. George attempted to make closing comments, but his usual smooth delivery was nowhere to be found. His hands were shaking, his voice was unsteady, and his credibility lay in ruins. Within minutes, the footage was everywhere. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from overwhelming support for Samuel to complete condemnation of George's approach. #SamuelDestroys began trending worldwide, accompanied by #BlackVoicesMatter and #Don'tTonePoliceTruth. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Media critics dissected George's interview tactics, with many noting that attempting to silence or moderate black voices on injustice was a form of racism in itself. Fellow journalists distanced themselves from his approach, recognizing that he had crossed a line from journalism into attempted censorship. From his car, Samuel posted a statement that became one of the most shared social media posts of the year. "My ancestors didn't survive slavery, segregation, and systemic oppression, so I could whisper about injustice. My voice is their voice. It will not be silenced, moderated, or made palatable for anyone's comfort." The response was unprecedented. Fellow actors of all races shared their own experiences of being told to moderate their voices on important issues. Civil rights leaders praised Samuel for refusing to be tone policed. Most powerfully, young activists shared how his films and his outspokenness had inspired them to speak their own truth. Conservative voices, surprisingly, also praised aspects of his response, particularly his refusal to be told how to think or speak by media figures. Liberal voices appreciated his unwavering commitment to justice issues. The rare cross-political support he received highlighted just how badly George had misread both his guest and the moment. George's reputation never recovered from the incident. The image of him sitting humiliated at the GMA desk after being systematically dismantled by one of America's most respected actors became a symbol of media overreach and the danger of trying to control authentic voices. At a film festival the following week, Samuel was asked about the confrontation. He said with characteristic intensity, I don't enjoy those kinds of exchanges, but I'll never apologize for speaking truth. The moment we start moderating our voices about injustice is the moment injustice wins. The interviewer asked what he hoped people would take from the incident. Samuel's response was measured but firm. I hope they understand that there's no polite way to discuss oppression. There's no comfortable way to talk about racism. And there's no quiet way to demand justice. If my anger about injustice makes you uncomfortable, good. It should. The revolution wasn't just in a celebrity refusing to be silenced. It was in exposing how certain media figures had appointed themselves as gatekeepers of acceptable Black expression. It was in proving that authentic anger about injustice is not only valid but necessary. It was in showing that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to make your truth palatable for others' comfort. Samuel L. Jackson didn't just walk off Good Morning America that day. He walked away from a culture that wanted to control how Black voices expressed their pain, their anger, and their demand for justice. He proved that success doesn't require silence. And he showed that sometimes the most powerful performance isn't in a movie. It's standing up for your right to speak truth without apology. Because that day, Samuel L. Jackson reminded everyone that some voices are too important to moderate. Some truths are too urgent to whisper. And some fights are too crucial to wage politely. The man who had spent decades bringing complex characters to life gave his most important performance that morning, not as an actor, but as a Black man who refused to let others dictate the terms of his existence or expression. And in the end, it wasn't Samuel L. Jackson who was humiliated. It was a system that had forgotten that freedom of speech means nothing if it comes with conditions on tone, style, or comfort level. That had forgotten that the most important voices are often the most uncomfortable ones. And that had forgotten that demanding justice has never been, and should never be, a quiet endeavor. Because real change has always been loud. Real progress has always been uncomfortable. And real truth has always made people angry. That's not a bug in the system. That's a feature. And Samuel L. Jackson wasn't about to let anyone forget it.